Hi and welcome everyone to the Raising Body Confident Kids expert series. Today we have Isabel Foxen Duke in the house. Oh, I am so delighted for you to be here today, Isabel. Many of you listening to this, Isabel will need no introduction at all. I know we talk about her work in the program. If you haven't heard of Isabel and this is your first introduction to her, you are in for an absolute treat. So welcome, Isabel. Thank you so much for being here. I want to start by asking you the question we ask many of our guests on this show. Can you please set the scene for us by telling us about a typical family meal when you were growing up?
It was really interesting that you asked this, because you had written via email, letting me know that you were going to ask this question as an introductory question. And I was thinking, I was like, wow, like when I was a kid, I feel like one of the challenges for me, I didn't recognize that it was a challenge at the time, but I don't have that many memories of family meals as a kid. My mom worked full time. My parents were divorced. And I had most of my meals served to me by a nanny or a babysitter or a caretaker. And it was very early on, early middle school, probably like by the time I was sort of in that like 11, 12 tween year time, when I really started to self-advocate for doing my own meals and providing my own meals for myself and, wanting to be more in control of my food. Largely because
Wow.
I was already dieting at that age. I mean, I was already aware, I think, and anyone else who's heard my story knows, I was put on my first diet by my pediatrician when I was 3 years old. So, I have been a dieter, or I was a dieter my entire childhood. And by the time I was 9, 10, I already wanted to be in control of my food so that I could eat less and so that I could be dieting, right? So, and because, I grew up in a household where my mom wasn't really there for meals. I was, my dad certainly wasn't there. I was able to kind of get what I wanted with the caretakers and kind of advocate for like, no, I'm going to eat what I'll eat later. I'm not hungry, that kind of thing. We didn't do a lot of family meals in my house. And I kind of see that now as a symptom of some of the dysfunction that was happening both for me personally and just like within my family system in general. Although not that, I think a lot of kids are in a position where their mothers are working and, that's their reality. I mean, that is the reality.
That's the reality of it. When you say dysfunction, are you talking about the general dysfunction of the way your family was operating, or are you talking about the dysfunction of food? Around food, or great.
Around food specifically. So there wasn't, I think that my parents are what you would call or what I call like casual dieters, meaning, they never identified as like hard, disordered eaters or, having like a real struggle with food, but both of, right. But both
totally my family. Yeah.
Right. But both of them, it was just like weight was always a thing, it was always, just, we've got to be careful. We have to like make sure that we don't gain too much weight. It was sort of just in the ether, which I think is the mainstream point of view. I think that's most people, unfortunately.
Yes.
And again, it got really heightened by the fact that when I was very, very young, I had this sort of diagnosis. I was a very, very small, I was a toddler when I was put on my first diet at the recommendation of my pediatrician because I was high on the baby BMI scale, right? Like I was in like the 95th percentile in weight or something along those lines, or I don't even remember, I don't even know what the numbers was, but for whatever reason, I guess I was like a chubby baby as a 3-year-old. And so my doctor, my well-meaning, but, problematic pediatrician, suggested that, that I was put on this diet. And my mom sort of jokingly refers to it as like the skim milk, the broccoli and skim milk diet, where carbs were heavily restricted. It was all like low fat, dairy, low, kind of lean proteins, that whole thing. And my entire childhood, I felt out of control around food. Like my entire childhood, I felt insatiable. I felt like I was just one of those kids who just who just wanted everything and just would clean their plates constantly. And I just, I identified as a human being who just wanted all the food. And, my girlfriends or my other kids in my class who would just like kind of be done with their lunch, at 3/4 of the way through or whatever, or would just, be like, oh, I've had enough candy. I just didn't even understand that. Like, I was just like, well, like, I guess you're just different than me because, if I don't actively sit on my hands trying not to eat the thing, I will eat it all. I will eat everything. And I now recognize that that was a response to feeling deprived around food constantly as a kid, starting at a so young of an age that I don't even remember having a normal relationship with food, where food was just food and it's like a thing that tastes good and it's like nourishing and sometimes you want it, sometimes you don't want it. That never even occurred to me. For me, food was always front and center of my life, right? Again, if I felt like if I didn't actively sit on my hands trying not to eat, I would just tear through the cabinets all the time. And that I recognize now is I was largely undernourished.
This is very, very typical experience of kids who are restricted. Like, even if it's not, like such a common thing now is not, I mean, everyone's horrified at the idea of putting a child on a diet now, but they're not horrified of only feeding them whole food or only feeding them, low carb or oh no, it's not a diet, it's health food, but it's still it's an experience from the child's point of view of there are things I'm not allowed.
I mean, it's like, I always think like it's such a joke. It's like, let's call a spade a spade. It's a diet. You're trying to make your child thinner. You're trying to actively change what they eat to like force their body to look a way that you think that it should look. And so, or the way the doctor thinks it should look, or whatever the case may be, right?
Or prevent something happening in the future, right? Make sure they eat this ways.
Better not. She might get too fat, right? Like, so like her weight's going up. We don't want a fat baby, like, right. So and I think that that's, certainly was the case for me. I mean, I remember at some point my mom saying something to me along the lines of the doctor sort of implying like, she's got to be careful. Like that was sort of the language. It was like, well, I wasn't having any actual health complications, not that necessarily they would be related to my size anyway, which is another conversation for another time. But, at the time it was just like, oops, like, be careful, gotta be careful. Right. And so there was always this sense of I have to be careful around food all the time, which created this relationship with food where I felt like it was a ticking time bomb. And if I didn't, if I wasn't careful, right, all hell would break loose and I would eat everything in sight and I would, like gain. Of course, the big fear was I would gain weight. No one would love me, right? Like, I mean, all of the things that we associate with weight gain and fat phobic culture in which we live. And so, it's sort of chicken or the egg. Like I never, even though the first diet I was put on was by my doctor, I never really thought of it as a health concern. I was always very aware from as early as I can remember that the real issue was like how people were going to treat you. And the real issue was, like popularity and like, being like cool with the cool kids and whatever else it was that I cared about as a child.
Well, there's really interesting research. I don't know if you've seen it. Asking 5-year-olds, so we're talking about 5-year-olds, will indicate that they want to be friends with thinner kids because bigger kids are lazier and meaner and just not as nice, right?
And so not cool, not pretty, right? Like I think it goes
5-year-olds, that's right, are already understanding it's a status issue and they have no understanding of health. Like a 5-year-old doesn't know what healthy is. Like it's that's way beyond their pay grade, but they get friendships and they get, that. So that's, what you're experiencing is right in line with that, right?
Yeah. like the idea that this was a health concern was not really a thing for me. Like I was always, for me, it was I was always aware of it being a really primarily a status issue, and that was my primary concern. And as I got older and as I got to have more control over my food, right? And as I started to be like, well, no, I'm not hungry. I'll eat later. I'll get it myself. Right. Which was really for, I don't want you hovering around telling me what to eat. I want to be able to basically diet. I mean, I was doing both. I was kind of dieting, binging, you know, it was like the periods being really restrictive and in control, and then periods of just like cleaning out the refrigerator after my parents fell asleep. I mean, I was doing that whole cycle, right? I mean, they're two sides of the same coin, they go together. But I remember avoiding meals because I wanted to stick to a diet as young as, you know, 10, 11, something like that.
Wow.
And I was able to, largely because, I mean, for whatever reason, I was, you know, family meal. I was not a kid who was like forced to sit down and have dinner with the family every day by any stretch of the imagination. And I do remember like Sunday dinners, like that was the one night a week where, you know, my mom, you know, where both of my parents would be present, or at least two parental figures would be present. Me and my sister would get together and we would like really do it up. And it would be like, we would, you know, have like the steak and the this and the that. And my mom would like, there would be like usually a special dessert, and we'd have like candles at the table. And it was like this really great, wonderful, like celebratory thing. Although I remember being terrified of Sunday dinner because I remember feeling like I'm going to just like, and plot, either terrified that I was going to lose control and not be able to stick to my diet, or mostly I'd have false hope that I was like, okay, well, how am I going to get through Sunday dinner without, you know, eating the thing that is off limits to me right now, that I've decided is my current diet du jour, right? Like if I'm doing the, you know, a carb-free diet, how am I going to, you know, get through it? And I will say, in terms of just like my parents' quote dysfunction with food, again, I don't think neither of them had food issues the way that I did. I was definitely much more disordered than either of them. Again, they were kind of more the casual dieter types. When I would do things like say, no, I'm not eating rice. No, I'm not eating carbs. No, I'm not. When I would reject certain foods, they were fine with that. But they would comment if I, you know, went the other way, which happened frequently. I was constantly oscillating between restriction and being on these extreme diets, or not even so extreme diets, but just some sort of control method of some kind, and then falling off the control method and like wiping through, you know, half of the birthday cake or whatever the case may be. And
so they would say something when they saw that, and then what was your experience when they said it?
Oh, a lot of shame, you know, like really like I got caught, like I, you know, it just exacerbated what I already felt about myself when I would have the cake, which was just this like deep sense of like failure, like what's wrong with you? And then, you know, picking myself up by my bootstraps and like planning the diet for the next 6 weeks that of course I'd probably make like 2 or 3 days and then I'd binge again. You know, I mean, there was so many constant attempts at like, this time's going to be different. This time I'm going to get it. This time I'm going to finally like, you know, lose the weight. And it's funny, I in retrospect, but they would only, they pretty much, I don't remember ever feeling like my dieting was a problem. I think I remember more my inability to stick to the dieting as being the problem. I'm sure occasionally there were moments when my mom would kind of make fun of me a little bit about the fact that she kind of knew, she clearly saw this pattern of me like trying a million, it's Isabel's latest thing, right? Like this pattern of me trying a million diets and never really sticking to any of them, and none of them ever really working out. And that kind of became a little bit of a joke, maybe like, oh, her latest thing, like, what's your latest dietary restrict? What do I need to tell grandma that you're not eating at Easter dinner this year, you know? And so there was a little bit maybe of like an eye roll kind of vibe when it became really obvious that I was just doing this, but there was never like, hey, I'm concerned about like your relationship with food. Like in retrospect, I think if I had been behaving that way and was much thinner, everyone would be very concerned.
Yeah.
It seems like really obvious eating disorder behavior for, you know, a 14-year-old, 15-year-old girl to have gone through every diet in the book ever and, you know, be constantly avoiding this and avoiding that. And then having, you know, nights where, you know, we wake up and the entire jar of peanut butter is gone, or, you know, whatever. Like that was my mom's clear observation of me. But that was never thought of I was never treated like, oh, I'm concerned that she's struggling with an eating disorder, or I'm concerned that this is really a psychological issue, which it was. It was a very serious psychological problem. I was in a huge amount of distress over my weight all of the time. But it kind of went unnoticed. It kind of got this feeling of like, oh, poor girl can't get her weight under control. Like that was the energy that I was getting, was like, oh, you know, Isabel just like, you know, she's just can't get it together.
It's so interesting you say that. Even when I told my parents I had an actual eating disorder, because I was average sized, there was no concern. And I remember them even saying to me once that a friend of theirs daughter had anorexia. Like that was a real problem.
Like that's real. Yeah.
That's real. She's really skin and bone. She was anorexic and skinny. Right. And that was a real problem. But my problem, was just kind of unfortunate.
Right.
You know,
right.
that I can't get it together, as opposed to, hang on a minute, we've got a child here who has a real desperate need for some help. Yeah. Right.
So I will say on the flip side, you know, something, and I apologize about the light right now in my eye, but what I will say on the flip side about my mom in particular, which was really nice, was that she was also really willing to help me in any way that I asked for it. So regardless of, she didn't like, you know, necessarily express like this sort of empathetic concern about my eating habits, but she, you know, if I said to her, hey, I feel like I really want to go see a nutritionist, or hey, I really, right, like she would let me go. She would, she would, you know, she would pay and she would make it happen.
Yep.
And what I will say there is, you know, again, sort of like, not to put too much blame on my mother, when I would go even talk to the nutritionists around what I was dealing with, or even talk to clinicians about what I was dealing with, they also would not take me seriously, right? They also would kind of be like, okay, well, let's just like get you eating like 3 meals and 3 snacks a day. But like, that's kind of the end of the story. Like there was no real like therapeutic understanding of what's going on, even though it, you know, you would think that a nutritionist who had, you know, a young girl coming to her saying, you know, I, you know, feel out of control. I can't stop eating. I'm trying every diet in the book, right? Like you would think that that would like put up red flags. But it didn't, you know, because again, I didn't meet the weight class. Like I didn't meet anorexic standard, which I was never going to meet, because like that was not literally possible for me. You know, it's quite sad to say that I tried, you know, unfortunately.
I get that.
Yeah. Totally. So I'm one of those folks who's like, I, you know, thank God every day for my binge eating, because God forbid, had I not, you know, had these periods where I, you know, was eating a bunch of food, I would have gone into starvation. I would have gone into energy deficit. I now recognize that, you know, binge eating is what kept me healthy and safe as a kid, despite the fact that at the time, for a long time, I thought that that was the problem, right? I thought binge eating was the problem. The problem was actually that I was dieting and trying to underfeed myself regularly. And, you know, thank God I would have periods where I would make up for those lack of carbohydrates or whatever the case may be, because who knows what my body would have gone through had that not been the case.
Oh, I totally get it. I want to go back to a point you made, because I think this is something that people listening to this are potentially dealing with themselves at the moment. And that's having been taught, like your parents were clearly told by a professional who is, you know, we want to trust, right?
Right.
And that they should put you on a diet. And so that's what happened, right? So
they were told. Yeah.
So obviously, if we're in this situation now, what do you wish your parents had known at that point?
I mean, I wish that my parents, and there's no way that they could have done this, right? Because
Of
again,
course.
really a lot of this problem stems from medical weight discrimination, the normalization of dieting as an intervention for health when there is no evidence that dieting is a safe or effective intervention for any kind of health problem, let alone, fatness, if you even want to call that a health problem, which I do not think it is.
Let alone a 3-year-old, right?
Chubby little baby 3-year-old, but I mean, even for grown adults, right? And so but I so I mean, really, I think that this is not, if I were a parent, it's like I completely understand why a parent would go to a trusted medical professional to ask, be like, what should I, is my baby okay? Right. I mean, I can't imagine how scary it would be to get told by, any kind of doctor or clinician, oh, your baby is, going to have health problems because of their size. And of course, I would immediately go into becoming probably super controlling about my child's food, because my child is my precious one who I want to take care of. Right. So I think, unfortunately, this is not a problem that starts with parents. This is a problem that starts with clinicians. And this is a problem that starts with, a medical system that is, at this point in time, basically offering unethical interventions for, these issues for a variety of like political reasons that I can't even go down the list.
That we could be all week talking about that.
It's like there's not enough time to talk about all of the reasons why doctors are recommending diets despite all, research and evidence to the contrary. So,
and written in their what do you call it? Not notes, but in their kind of ethics. Do not put, pediatricians have notes that say, under no circumstances put a child on a calorie restricted diet. Under no circumstances. Not under no circumstances if they're over a certain, just don't do it. And they still do it.
I see, and I didn't even know that. That's I'd be curious to learn more about that offline. But so I think that this is really, in the grand scheme of things, this is something that's going to have to change at the institutional level.
Yes.
But as far as, there are so many, I think there's, pros and cons to this wellness industry, right? And I think, the parenting industry, right? The parenting blogger land, right? Is no exception.
Hello.
Right, exactly. There's a lot of that come out of kind of alternative parenting, right? You don't have to be, there's parents who just kind of do the mainstream recommendation. And then there are parents who are often starting from birth, from pre-birth, from prenatal, right? I mean, I live in San Francisco and all my best friends are doulas, right? So, we understand where in my universe, we're kind of skeptical of the clinical mainstream going into it, right? In the land of parenting, when you think about clinical, skepticism of the clinical world, that's not just about food and health at every size and how we treat our kids around eating. That happens at every stage of the pregnancy and pre-pregnancy process and child development process, right? So if you are a person who is kind of, has, I think, a healthy critique, and obviously clinical medicine does amazing, incredible things and keeps people alive and is really important, right? This is complicated stuff. This is not to be simplified. But if you're a person who, is, kind of open to the possibility that clinicians don't always know best, right? And want to do your own research, having some basic understanding and kind of just being willing to hear the health at every size perspective, and, learn more about the dangers of diets, which I would just, for the purposes of this interview, just consider any attempt at weight control, right? Anything adjusting my food for the purpose of trying to create a certain size or lose weight or whatever, or even, control weight in any way, versus the flip side of a weight controlling perspective on health. What I try to think of is, how do I take care of this body, and whatever weight this body ends up at, when I'm taking good care of her, when I'm, nourishing her well and balancing her blood sugar and getting her enough sleep and giving her enough water, right? When she is taken care of, whatever weight she ends up at is whatever weight she ends up at. It's her healthy weight by definition.
Yes.
So, and it's interesting because with my adult clients who I work with now, I will often say to my adult clients, how would you feed your little baby daughter? Would you feed her with like, okay, we just got to like make her thin and make sure she looks right? Or would you want to nurture her and care for her and nourish her, and whatever weight she ends up at when we're treating her well and taking care of her is the weight she ends up at? And I will use that as an example of what self-nurturance and what weight neutral health means when I'm explaining this concept to adults who are going through the diet recovery process themselves and recover.
I love that. I just can't tell you how much I love that, because that makes so much sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it takes all that pressure to bring it down into something really simple and go, what's the most nurturing thing I can do? And I know myself when it's full of control and restriction and shoulds and shouldn'ts, that does not feel nurturing. When I go into my body and go, does that feel nurturing? It's like, no.
Tense and anxious and nervous, and like food is a landmine. I mean, so there's a woman named Gwyneth Olwyn whose work I really like, and she is, she works with clinical eating disorders, right? She's like hardcore, like what is the evidence for clinical eating disorders? But her definition of an eating disorder is the misidentification of food as a threat, right? This feeling like food is not safe. Like if I eat that,
got it. Right?
Much of that, it's going to be bad. Like I'm moving through the world of food and it's a landmine, right? Which is how I felt, despite the fact that I was binge eating and, having weight fluctuations and yo-yo dieting and chubby at different points and blah, blah, blah. Despite all of that, the reality of the situation is that I was living life feeling like food was a threat. My body was a threat and food was a threat, right? Like, these are the two things that were my biggest concern. My biggest concern in life, my biggest worry in life was, am I going to, how am I going to eat tomorrow, or how am I going to not break my diet tomorrow so that I can maintain my weight, and then everything will be okay, right? If I can maintain my weight, everything will be okay. Everyone will love me. I'll be cute and popular. Like all of my friendships will be good. All the boys will have a crush on me, or whatever my like sixth grade mind, thought at the time. But probably those are the things.
I love that. I want to repeat it. I want to repeat it again because it's so beautiful. So food does not feel like a threat, which is it's so consistent with what we're teaching in our program, is like raising kids
food
to
positive.
Be competent eaters, and a competent eater is not scared of food. A competent eater has no fear, because but an anxious eater or those things are not competence.
Eating, I think of different words for different strokes for different folks, right? You're using the sadder terminology, but I often just will say like quote unquote normal eaters, right? Like just like has their food, sometimes they want to eat it, sometimes they don't, sometimes they eat a delicious thing. It's like no big deal, right? I mean, that I think is the core goal of a lot of my work, right? What drives women into my programs is because they get to a point where what they want even more than thinness in their life is for food to just not be a big deal. Like for food to just be okay, for food to just.
And the freedom of that is extraordinary.
Right.
And so if we're starting with our 3-year-old who is on the bigger end of the BMI, we've been told by a professional, it's really hard. I just have so much compassion for parents who are in that position where there's a difference between intellectually knowing I'm not going to take the advice of this professional and being able to speak that out your mouth, like that's and I totally have compassion for that and want to let parents know it's okay to just say nothing and leave,
Yeah.
like even if that's all you do for your child, you have done something quite magnificent.
Right. I mean, yeah, unfortunately, for better or for worse, we are in a situation where in order to get weight neutral care, you really have to seek it out, right? Your
Yeah,
average
you do.
pediatrician is going to be on the diet train, is going to be, I mean, this is what everyone is being taught in med school, right? It is a hardcore institutionalized system, right? Like this
Yes.
is what is
Yeah.
happening in our medical system. Is it weight is now a proxy for health. It wasn't always that way, right? There's political reasons why it became
No.
that way. This is not about science. This is not about, right? But there is, this is the reality of our medical institution, medical establishment right now, right?
Yes.
So you have to really seek it. You have to seek sort of alternatives, similarly the way that you might seek out natural birthing, if that's like a thing that you are into, or whatever else it may be, right? I mean, at this time, this is, if you decide, if you do the research and you're like, you know what, I see blatantly the harm that a focus on weight can have on a child, especially a female child, but increasingly all gendered children, and certainly trans children are even greater risk.
Way higher. Yeah.
Their conversation, right?
Yeah.
If you're a person who really sees, like, I don't want my daughter growing up feeling like her body's not okay, which is the reality for most girls growing up and most children growing up right now. If you are like, that seems like a pretty big risk that I don't want to take on. I want to limit the possibility of my daughter growing up feeling like her body's not safe to live in, like her body's not okay. She can't be herself in her body. That affects everything in her life going forward. I mean, there is not a single area of my life where my body image has not touched, right? And I don't think that any woman in her right mind can't, like, when we start, not in her right mind,
totally
really think about it, right? When you really internalize it, I mean, it's like long-term relationship satisfaction, sex life, it's just social. I mean, it's just so deep, like feeling like your body's not okay affects everything. And so if you're like, you know what, I'm going to try to do my best to make sure that my kid deals with that as little as possible, knowing that you are also, as parents, not fully in control of your kid's body image, right? I mean, your kid's body image is being influenced by everyone on the planet, right? We can do our best as parents and we're still just parents, but if you are a person who's decided that you want to do, the best that you can to protect your kid from, that way of operating around food in their bodies, that means by definition, seeking out weight neutral resources whenever possible. And when not possible, right? Like if your kid is dealing with a medical issue that comes up where they need to see a specialist or somebody where, there's a weight neutral provider is not possible. Usually that will include having some sort of intermediary or, having support from a clinician who is weight neutral, who can kind of go between, or taking responsibility yourself to be educated enough to be that intermediary to kind of, be the in-between between the doctor and whatever the ultimate outcome is. Right. So,
and I know. So I love what you say. Like, but deciding we're not going to change the whole medical profession overnight. That's just the reality of it.
Yeah.
And there are some really, I know there are some really strong things we can do when we take on that role. We can say things like, "Please don't ever mention my child's weight in the room."
Mm-hmm.
We can, if that's too hard to say when we're there.
Right.
We can email ahead and say it's really important. You do never to mention weight. If weight needs to be talked about, do it on the phone to me where they can't hear it. Yep. Is there anything else you can suggest that might help with this?
Obviously, that would include like weight blind ways or no ways. I don't know exactly what the sort of medical, obviously there are certain medical situations where weighing is important or relevant outside context of fat phobia. And so I don't know what those would be with children specifically, but generally speaking, making, having your kids at least not have to see the number or engage with the number, or that not being a conversation that's happening. And I think for even just like when food comes up in general, if I had my child going and talking to a clinician, even if the clinician was not actively weight neutral, which most of them are not, I wouldn't even really want them to talk about healthy eating or food in front of me, because I would be probably concerned that information would be tainted by diet culture in some way. I'd be curious for them to tell me what they think the nutrition recommendations are, or what they're concerned about health-wise that might be related to nutrition. And then I could kind of translate that in a weight neutral way, or if I'm not sure how to deal with it in a weight neutral way, like if they're recommending a restriction of a major macronutrient for my child or something along those lines, I would definitely want to run it by a weight neutral clinician and ask if there's an alternative option.
100%. I love what you say. So it's not just making really clear boundaries about weight, but it's also about particular ways of eating or just discussing food. And I love to what you say on top of that, to say, run it past someone. So anyone in this program can run it past me. If I can't help you specifically with that, I have many people I can, I have many resources that can support and gather around. But that's really, really important to remember. It's health and it's food. It's all those conversations, and exercise too, because it's hard to get exercise information that it doesn't have some kind of diet culture-y undertone to it that can kind of come out.
Right. Like one of the problems with diet culture is not just the weight focus, but this sort of assumption that, carbs are optional, like we just talk about food as if it's kind of optional, as opposed to us being like biological animal humans who actually do need eat and do need quite a bit of food and do need a variety of different foods in order to survive healthfully, right? But the health construct around food in our culture is very much one where, restrictions as a health recommendation are thrown around willy-nilly as if that's like it's as if that's
unquestioned
way to solve health problems, right?
Solve
your health problem naturally. Just cut out all these food groups. That's the natural solution, right? So unnatural and in a good portion of instances super dangerous.
Super dangerous. And I think this is a great time for us to, because I know we talked a little bit about this offline before we started, to segue into teenagers, because it's one thing being able to really be that advocate for your younger child when you still have that kind of communication with your younger child that is far easier. And then they become teenagers, and then there's that very natural, very necessary, very healthy thing they do where all of a sudden their peer group is far more important to them than us. Like things that come out our mouth, it's quite common for it to be like raised eyebrows, not listening, you're the
right.
So how do we segue ourselves from being this parent who is on top of that stuff to letting them go? I know we talked, and what I'd love to talk to you about in particular is we talked about how this in particular is a time of life when we've got teenagers where we have to do our best to deal with our own grief in this situation and to deal with our own sense of loss and damage that's happened to us and be in order to support them in some ways.
So this is really the issue with teenagers and supporting teenagers around this conversation, is that by the time folks are teenagers, the reality of the situation is we don't have as much control over their food, their relationship with their bodies, right? I mean, at that point, they have gotten so many inputs from the culture at large outside of your parent-child relationship. And they are already going through, as you pointed out, the sort of individuation phase where they are already prioritizing their relationship with the greater world over maybe their relationship with you, right? Or your recommendations. Yeah, which again is healthy, right? This is important.
Totally.
Becoming adults. This
Yeah.
is on the way to adulthood. This is necessary.
Yeah.
But I think what's, one thing that's really challenging with teenagers is, I think for parents of teenagers is kind of finding this like kind of fine line of how do I hold space for my teenager who's struggling? How do I support or model, body positive behaviors for my teenager while also, recognizing and dealing with the fact that at the end of the day, I don't have control over what my teenager does at school. I don't have control over what she eats at school. And, I'm ultimately not in control over her relationship with food really at all at that point, right? It's kind of like we pray to God that we did the best we could. And like, again, it's not even what we did when they were kids is not always enough to protect them because they have so many inputs coming from all over the place. I mean, I was definitely not just influenced by my parents. I was influenced by everyone, everything around me in this culture, right? So so some of that I think is navigating my own feeling, right? Navigating our own feelings about the fact that we can't protect them from everything and we can't control, which I think comes up in other areas for teenage parents outside of food. Right?
I mean, 100%.
Drinking, sex, everything. It's like, we're just moving into a land where we no longer have full control. We have some limit, some ability to set boundaries with our teenage kids, but it's so much less than it used to be. And, they're actively fighting against us. When it comes to food, I think that, and this is just, I will say I am not a expert in teenage specific food stuff. I feel like there are lots of people who could bring into this, but my instincts around this and sort of what I've talked about this with my clients is navigating my own feelings about sort of like, okay, where can I let go and grieve and deal with my own feelings about the fact that I can't really control their relationship with food at once they get into that age group. And I can't control their relationship with their bodies at that age group, but also still being a parent in the sense of paying attention, right? Like noticing, are they struggling? What's going on? Do they need help? And providing, empathy and support where it feels appropriate to do so. And I think that this sort of empathy and support rather than control is an interesting kind of also kind of messy conversation, right? Because I think in a lot of instances, what kids really need is for us to be there for them and to know that, they are loved. And even though they might be getting all the crap at school, right, at least their home is a safe place for them to be themselves. And,
I love that you say that. I love that you pick on the word control specifically, because what I think there's two things at play here that you're pointing to with a lot of wisdom. Is that, first of all, many of us who have had disordered eating or eating disorders have a relationship with control that's interesting, and
control issue.
We've got control issues, right? And then when we're parents, to be aware of our personal need for control is going to be super, super helpful when it comes to being able to let our teenagers go and make mistakes. And I know that I talk a lot in the program about this topic, about how do we let our kids go, so that if they get in trouble, they can come back to us.
Exactly.
Because as soon as we're like, you shouldn't do that, you should never, don't be aware of, and then they fall over. They're like, I'm not telling mum because she's just going to wag her finger at me or make me feel ashamed. And
now they have nowhere to go when
now they have nowhere to go, right?
They don't feel like home is safe either. Now all of a sudden school's not safe and home's not safe because I'm going to so
exactly
keeping home a safe space where like they are accepted and embraced and welcomed, you know,
that's right.
super important with boundaries. I mean, I think that
of course,
line here, and I think that there's a line here with food too, in terms of like, you know, if you're concerned that your child is struggling with, you know, self-harming behaviors with food that are, you know, scaring you, that may be a reason to be like, okay, I don't care what you say, you're going to the doctor right now.
Exactly, 100%.
Right. So like there's still you're still in that land of some control. Like you couldn't do that when they're 24 and paying their own rent. Right. So
no. And there's a difference between, hey, you're at home, we pay the bills, you come to the dinner table, right? Because this is what we do, or whatever it is. I'm not saying anyone has to do that, but I'm saying these are the family rules. But then if they don't eat anything at the dinner table, keep your mouth closed. You know, you know, and if your child is lucky, I don't know, privileged, I don't know, enough to grow into their teenage years with intuitive eating still intact in themselves. I mean the rare nugget that one of those is, and then you see them start to try, you know, start to get interested in their peers who have not grown up with that and want to do those things. We can talk to them about the dangers without controlling them. You know, that's what you're saying, isn't it? It's
having a relationship with our kids rather than trying to just make them do what we want them to do.
Yeah. And that's going to go so much better when we have when we start to own our own control and our own body issues, right?
This is the other flip side of this, is that, you know, teenagers are one of these ages where, you know, I kind of think like you don't have control over a lot, but something you can do is lead by example. You don't know if they're going to follow your lead, but and you have no control over whether they do, and you have to accept the fact that there are a million other factors, right? There's things affecting your kid, but right, at the very least, you can make your home a body positive space, right? At the very least, you can create a space where, you know, your kid is safe to live in their body, even if they don't feel safe to live in their bodies at school.
Love that. Make your home a body positive space.
Yeah.
Do you have like a top 10 for that? I mean, I know we could talk a whole week on that as well, but
so there's so many things. I mean, and there's like levels to it. I mean, there's the obvious stuff, which is mostly about how we talk about food and bodies, right? Which, by the way, you know, most of our diet mentality is subconscious, right? Most of our diet mentality, when we start doing this work, we don't even realize is diet mentality. So always doing ongoing work to peel the onion of our fat phobia and our diet mentality, because I guarantee you, just deciding, oh, I'm not going to fat shame. Oh, I'm not going to body shame. You don't even probably know the depths, the levels of which, like,
it's an iceberg, right?
Right. It's
a tiny bit poking out of the top.
Totally. So constantly be doing the work to unpeel the layers of your own diet mentality and your own fat phobia, right? And I think sometimes people have shame about being fat phobic or having diet mentality, like, oh, I don't do that. Like, oh, my kids, I hear this a lot from parents. Oh, I would never say anything in front of, I have a raging eating disorder, but I would never say anything in front of my kids. They've always been completely protected from it. And I'm like, there's no way in hell that they have not picked up on your general, like, hardcore belief system around food. Again, I apologize about this light right now.
Totally fine.
So, you know, the best way to create a body positive home is to be constantly doing the work of unpeeling your subconscious and recognizing that that is a lifelong process. That's not just a decision you make one day, right? We all, myself included, I've been doing this work professionally for a decade now, and I still have diet mentality, fat phobic stuff to be constantly unpeeling. And I'm amazed how it pops up out of nowhere still, right? So to be always doing that work.
Same.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Other things that you can do that are kind of just like more fun, but I think that are just things to think about are, having body positive art in your home, right? Like having, literally celebrating body diversity. I mean, it sounds almost cliche, like it almost sounds like so obvious, but one of the biggest problems, one of the things that's affecting your kids more than anything else is just straight up the images that they look at in the media.
Oh,
And again,
100%.
we hear this over and over and over again. It sounds like, trite at this point, but it's really true. It's evidence-based. Like this is real science, right? And so if you can have, images in your home, or even just, I don't know how you can really, I mean, for yourself, also working on your own fat phobia, a great way to do that is to, expose yourself to body positive media, whether it be through, social or whatever.
I love what you say, Isabel, because that's some we have in the program. We talk a lot about how do we get our kids to see more diversity of everything, right? Just bodies,
race,
in the great kind of rainbow that they come in, right?
Yeah.
So we do that, and there's some really good ways to do that. You have a social media contract with your child. When they start, they have to go through diversity training. It's just one of the things. You don't get a phone without it, right? End of story.
Yes.
But what I haven't considered is those, and we do, declutter diet culture messages, but not then repopulating with the art or with the books or with
adding in is actually more important.
It's really good.
I'll tell you why. Adding in is actually more important because you can declutter, and the truth is it's still going to get in there, right? Like it's still, right? The baseline is the thin ideal. The baseline is the white ideal. The baseline, and you can declutter all you want, and that's still going to be the baseline, right? That's still always.
Yeah. So true. So
right?
true.
So if you are not adding in actively images of underrepresented body diversity, right, that you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle, right? So like I have I love my body positive art. I have like my
cool.
I have my like fat girl collage in my bathroom that I love, that was made for me by actually an artist who worked at one point for the bodypositive.org, who's like a friend of mine in California, right? I mean, so it's just and obviously my own Instagram feed is intentionally curate adding in plus models and various kinds of body diversity, and it's the primary homework that I give all of my clients. That's just something they have to do right away. So so adding in, not just taking out, is really, really important.
And I can see that, like we do that in a digital space, but I hadn't really considered that whole physical, but like your coffee table and your walls and your bookshelf, like I'm like, get rid of all the diet books, but put back body positivity. Love it. Yeah. So that's awesome. So have you got any more,
how to make up? So the question now is how to make a body positive home.
No. Yes. Sorry. Right. Yes, it is.
Right.
No.
Yes. Right. So I think those are the big ones. And it's just sort of what you're talking about. Again, I think even in the realm of dialogue, it's not just what you don't say, it's also what you do say. Yes. And just having conversations in the home that celebrate body diversity as much as possible. I mean, on a deeper level, and this isn't always easy, but it's just something to think about, is like, think about your own community, right? Like, is there opportunity for more like integration of diversity in your own community? I think that a lot of us are living in very segregated communities, sometimes by force. Like we literally live in this like little rural white town where there's like not a single person of color or whatever for however far away. But I think in a lot of cases, segregation just kind of happens, unconsciously or subconsciously, even though there's more opportunity for integration. And I think that certainly, is the realm in areas of not just race, but size and gender, all of these things. Right. And so again, it's not easy. It's not like, oh yeah, I'll just go get some fat friends, like it's not quite, right. That's not quite what we're talking about, but just starting to think about, right. When you start to think about diet mentality and fat phobia in your own mind, something to also just consider is, your community and your relationships. And, you could even go deeper into, you can't really control the medical industry, but you can certainly self-activism. I mean, it starts to get into a question of how much
it starts getting down and down. And another thing we are really big on in our home, and is one of those, it's pretty easy, to pick off, is we, in the same way that we completely no tolerance for misogynistic jokes or for racist jokes, we're like, size jokes, 100%, like, we just come down on that. Like, if you live in our house, you do not make those kind of comments. And I just imagine myself as a teenager when I was going, like, even if I had still ended up with an eating disorder, if I had a house where my family were like, you don't make size jokes, you don't talk about weight, like, even if there was that little sanctuary,
that would be huge.
It would have been, I'm not saying it guarantees I wouldn't have gone where but I think the recovery process would have been very different.
Significant. It's huge, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, your primary household is not the, end all be all influencer in your life, but it's a big one, it's a big one. And just creating it's very possible that if you don't create a body positive home, your kid will have no body positive haven to go to. Your kid will have no body positive safe space to be in where they feel like they can be safe in their body. Right. So,
absolutely.
It's sort of like up to us to create those spaces, because it's not the mainstream space. It's not available everywhere. Right. Like, we have to create unfortunately.
I love it. And
want to mention too, because this comes up a lot with my clients, is like having conversations with like aunts and uncles or grandparents, or like setting boundaries around what other family members who may not know about this stuff, anyone who has influence on your kid's life, kind of thinking about what boundaries might look like with them. And I think boundaries are a difficult conversation because, as you said, sometimes you don't feel comfortable, right? The comfort level sharing and talking and setting verbal boundaries, but there's a lot of different ways to set boundaries. Sometimes you can even just set them non-verbally, right? Like, okay, if this comes up, we're going to leave.
Absolutely. Or you can have a fun thing you can do with your children is, if someone says something inappropriate, an uncle or whatever, you can have a private hand signal.
Yeah.
Like, you can have a
right.
Like, and it becomes this little, we're all doing our the uncle doesn't know what he said, but all of a sudden it creates this, like, we all know he said something cuckoo,
Right. I love that.
Isn't that cool? So it's like, it creates a little, it's easy. It doesn't create any drama, or
love that.
We don't have to have a fight.
Right.
It's just a,
I love that. That's a really good one. And it just kind of like, lets the kid, it's almost like the kid gets to be in on it.
Exactly. And it gives them power. It gives them power and feels really acknowledged.
We're not on that. We're not into that. I love that. I could see myself loving that as a teenager too. Like, I could see that really working for me as a teenager.
Exactly. Because then you're not dealing with the embarrassment of mum's just said something.
Right. I get to be like the inside scoop,
Yeah. Oh, look, Isabel, I could talk all day but thank you so much for being here and your wisdom. And I love how you talk about the deep importance of letting them go, dealing with our own control, and creating this body positive environment in our home. Super important.
it's like once they're teenagers, it's kind of like they are sort of out there doing their thing, and we can only hope that they are, you know, being as safe as possible on their own. But at least if they come to me, if they're in my house, it's a safe space, you know, or as safe as I can possibly make it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And if anyone wants to take the conversation with you deeper, you know, absolutely recommend Isabel's work for going to a really finding that freedom an incredible way. You can find your details under this podcast interview. Yeah. I'm not sure whether it's a podcast or an interview, but whatever it is, wherever you find it, you will also find link to Isabel's work.
Definitely. I mostly work with adults. So if you are a person who's just kind of curious or working through where diet mentality or fat phobia may still exist within you, which I imagine is most of you at different levels, right?
100%.
Wherever you are on that path, you know, I think that that's where my work really, you know, kind of is most useful and most helpful. And then also, I don't know if there are any, you know, wellness professionals in this group or, you know, therapists, coaches, folks of that kind, but I do a lot of professional training as well in terms of weight.
Wow.
Yeah, that's sort of the latest iteration of my work in the past 3 or 4 years. So you can kind of look at that also at weightneutralcoaching.com.
I was going to say, is that specifically to help people in that wellness therapeutic area become weight neutral and make sure you get fantastic. Exactly. I love that you're doing that.
You know, coaches, clinicians, wellness professionals, anyone who is working in the realm of health or in any way or wants to work in the realm of health in any way. Yeah. This is really a training for giving them weight neutral health coaching skills and diet recovery, right? So
awesome. Yeah. So we will put a link to that as well, Isabel.
Both of them. Yeah. Great. Cool.
Fabulous.
Oh yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. What a fantastic conversation.